Robert E. Lee by Lee Roddy. Chapter 8, Victory Cheers. Lee the soldier stayed clear of political wrangling in South Carolina. While President Davis heard complaints from Beauregard and Johnston, Lee took a short personal trip to visit the burial site of his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, on Cumberland Island off Georgia. Memories of good days rushed before him as he viewed the grave. In South Carolina, Lee saw again the big gray horse he had so admired in the rainy, dreary days of Western Virginia. Major Thomas Brown of the 3rd Virginia had offered the 16 hands high horse to Lee when they first met, but Lee had declined. Brown said he had paid $175 for the gray. The horse, bred by Andrew Johnston out of Gray Eagle stock, was called Jeff Davis after the Confederate president. It had won first place in the county fairs in 1859 and 1860. Lee had called the horse "my colt," although he had not purchased him in Virginia's hills. Now, in South Carolina, the offer was repeated, except the major wanted the general to have the horse as a gift. "I can't accept him," Lee explained, "but if you will willingly sell him to me, I will gladly use him for a week or so to learn his qualities." Lee changed the Confederate grays, as he termed the color, name from Jeff Davis to Greenbrier. The general mounted the horse and rode him 35 miles that day. Lee paid $200 and took permanent possession of the horse, and again changed the animal's name from Greenbrier to Traveler. Lee, a man who had been judging good horse flesh all his life, wrote that Confederate gray had fine proportions, strong haunches, flat legs, small head, broad forehead, delicate ears, quick eyes, small feet, and a black mane and tail. Such a picture would inspire a poet. Lee and Traveler were together for the duration of the war. While Lee had been building defenses along the coast, the South had lost Fort Henry in Tennessee to Federal gunboats. Ulysses S. Grant, who had been in Mexico with Lee, grabbed off the Confederacy's Fort Donelson near Fort Henry. There were other rebel reverses too, but the greatest immediate danger was George B. McClellan. His 115,000 Union troops were poised outside of Richmond and divided into 3 units. The red-haired companion of Lee's days in Mexico needed only the spring rains to stop. Then he could strike and take the capital. The nearest armed prong was within 7 miles of Richmond. Lee received word from President Davis on March 2nd. "I wish to see you here with the least delay." Lee hurried to Richmond, where bad news was everywhere. Defeat was in the air. The people were preparing to flee. Military records were made ready for evacuation. Prices of food shot up as shortages developed. A pound of tea was $10, an unheard of price. Other food items were equally high. Richmond's people were grim. They had lost the singing, flag-waving attitude of a few months before. Through these silent, numbered citizens, Lee made his way to the inner circles of official Richmond. There Lee was told Richmond will be abandoned. Lee was not often known to show emotion, but this news distressed him. His voice revealed his deep feelings. "Richmond must not be given up. It shall not be given up," he exclaimed. Lee explained his position in a letter to his wife. "It will give me great pleasure to do everything I can to relieve him, Davis, and serve the country, but I do not see either advantage or pleasure to my duties." Lee was hampered by technicalities of command. Jeff Davis saw himself as a soldier. He had made Lee a public figure of command while keeping control of himself. Davis was fighting with Congress, and Lee was limiting limited in what he could do for Virginia. So, as official commanding general, but under the direction of the president and without authority, Lee planned the relief of Richmond. He had to work around the difficulty. Lee reasoned that defending Richmond was not wise. Instead, he believed attacking the poised McClellan armies would be a surprise and might force the Union troops back to Washington. McClellan had divided his troops into 3 attacking groups, but how does a smaller force defeat 3 Union armies? With boldness, Lee decided. If he could strike hard enough at one Union unit, the surprise and swiftness might confuse the other 2. But such a daring plan needed unusually brave leaders who would obey orders. Lee wanted Stonewall Jackson to strike Union generals Milroy, Banks, and McDowell. Union troops were near Fredericksburg, when hit hard by Washington a few miles away. When hit hard by Confederates, President Lincoln might fear the rebels were striking for Washington a few miles away. This was psychological warfare. Lee knew how much fear played in battles. There was one problem. Jackson was technically under the command of Joe Johnston, not Lee. Johnston was sensitive, unhappy with Lee and Davis. Still, Lee knew he needed a dependable Jackson to pull off part of the plan to relieve Richmond. In the May 31st battle near Richmond, known as Fair Oaks to the north and Seven Pines to the south, Johnston was severely wounded. Lee and Davis, under fire at the scene, saw Johnston carried on by a litter. He had a ball in his shoulder and a shell loaded with musket balls near his spine. The president dismounted as the general was loaded onto an ambulance wagon. Johnston opened his eyes, smiled, and gave Davis his hand. The president and Virginia's official but powerless commanding general rode back to Richmond that night. Davis twisted in his saddle and spoke to Lee, giving him command. It was that casual. Suddenly, without warning, Lee was in charge of a half-fought battle. With his plans already thought out, Lee moved to execute his surprise tactic on McClellan. He called in Jackson and explained the bold strategy. It required swift movement by the major general. Lee's plan was a masterstroke if properly executed, and the tall, silent Presbyterian layman was one of Lee thought could do it. Jackson was one general who would rather fight the enemy than his peers, and Jackson could not only take orders, he could carry them out. This was true of another man called in to help the Richmond plan, Jeb Stuart, frankly disappointed that Lee had been named commander, still obeyed Lee. Stuart, as one of the South's more dashing horsemen, had circled 150 miles around the enemy position, returning with valuable intelligence information. With Lee's daring plan and Jackson's swift action, 3 Northern generals soon reeled back into confusion and pain. Moving fast, Jackson hit Milroy and defeated him. Then Jackson spun around and surprised Banks. This second Union unit stood up to fight, but wilted under Jackson's slashing offensive. Soon Banks' troopers were driven across the Potomac. There remained one more Union threat. This one, Lee had figured, was to be fought primarily as a war of nerves. Would McDowell link up with McClellan and strike Richmond as one unit, or would McDowell become fearful and retreat? On May 27th, word came that McDowell was moving south, apparently to link up with the red-hatted McClellan. But 2 days later, the report changed. "Sir, he must believe he is facing superior forces," an officer said. "McDowell has turned back." A slight smile slipped across Lee's face as he heard the report. His strategy had triumphed. Fearing for his own safety and that of Washington, McDowell followed fellow officers Milroy and Banks north. General Stonewall Jackson, following Lee's tactics, had done the impossible. The combination of sudden high morale on the South's part and fear on the North with Jackson's victory sent McClellan fleeing. His routed troops strewed equipment all along the line of retreat. By the end of June, the man who had almost touched Richmond was told by President Lincoln to save your army at all events. McClellan, surprised that Lee had attacked his superior forces, had learned too late that Lee was a superior strategist. Within 90 days of Lee's return to Richmond, the two hostile armies' positions were completely reversed. Now Lincoln feared Washington was in danger. Lee reasoned that the North might sue for peace if the pressure was kept up. More Southern victories followed that summer. Lee's new Army of Northern Virginia won at Cedar Run, Slaughter's Mountain, and 2nd Manassas. Confederate troops were now at Washington's door, but Lee did not attack. His men were tired and hungry. They could not live off the land because it had already been scoured clean. The Confederate supply lines were stretched so thin that there was not enough food or ammunition. Lee reasoned that it was a military necessity to stop short of Washington, which was heavily defended with fresh troops. Leaders in the Confederacy knew the South's condition was somewhat relieved after Union General John Pope's defeat at 2nd Manassas. The North took one of the worst beatings of the war. The braggart Pope, whom Lincoln had sent to replace McClellan, fled in such disarray that he left great quantities of Union supplies for the ragged, hungry rebels. After the summer's victories, Lee expressed his gratitude to God. Slowly he penned a general order to the troops. The commanding general, profoundly grateful to the giver of all victory for the signal success which he has blessed our arms, tenders his warmest thanks and congratulations to the army, by whose valor such splendid results have been achieved. By September, Lee's need for supplies had become so critical that he had to seek food in another source, the North. Lee decided to invade Maryland. On September 5th, some 55,000 rebels began crossing the Potomac. The invaders had been invaded. Lincoln was forced to put McClellan back in command, replacing Pope. This time he would be more respectful of Lee's brilliant military mind. The rebels did not make a pretty sight marching into Maryland, but they were in high spirits, some singing as they marched. A northern eyewitness said, "They were dirty, lanky, ugly specimens of humanity, whose shocks of hair sticking through holes in their hats, and the dust thick on their dirty faces. These men who had driven back again and again are splendid legions." Lee hoped his invasion would cause the Union garrison to pull out of Harper's Ferry. When this didn't happen, Lee assigned Jackson to seize the arsenal to protect the rear of Lee's tattered soldiers. The next part of Lee's plan could have been put into effect had it not been for a strange incident. One of Lee's officers lost a package of cigars containing Lee's strategy. The information was found by a Union soldier and forwarded to McClellan. Now he had a distinct advantage. He knew about as much as Lee's plans as Lee himself.